Well, good morning. Let's start again. Thank you to Sagib Samachi University. Thank you to Onur for organizing this event, getting us back into the flow of having in-person events. Thank you to Titus for chaperoning us through this actually quite challenging project, especially during times of disruption. Thank you also for being here and for indulging me this morning. You will have picked up from the introduction that I have zero claim to be able to say anything about Arabic typography. So I will not use the word Arabic other than what I've just done now. I will stay away from that. So I'll be talking about things that relate to this project and I think our field. It's also an interesting time for me to mark T.S. Eliot's 100 years, how do you do this, from the publication of Wasteland, famous poem. Eliot wrote this, and that made me think quite a lot about how we approach our field and the development of expertise, reflection, and writing about our field. So, although it may be perhaps a bit of a stretch to call typeface design poetry, I think there is space for expression and visual exploration that might be relevant to that. There we are. Contemporary typographic practice exists at the nexus of literate culture, craft, educational frameworks, commercial imperatives, and demographic shifts. This practice takes place within the scope of technology that, whether conservative or transformative, represents layers of motivations, assumptions, and a long tail of decisions whose consequences far outlast their original frames of reference. It is also undergoing a process of growing complexity through the layering of globally shared models on top of increasingly recognized and sometimes quite volatile local and hyperlocal patterns. Digital culture has enabled trends towards revision and reevaluation of attitudes, styles, and scholarship. These develop inexorably, while at the same time compete with the flattening effect of models shared on platforms that prioritize relatively shallow, anglocentric cultural perspectives. Typography responds to and reflects this context, but not in a balanced, transparent, or unmotivated manner. It embodies the biases of tools, language, and the mechanism of dissemination, recognition, and reinforcement. Above all, it represents models of thinking about itself. What is exactly seen as the practice of typography in each context, how it is described and passed on, and how it embodies spaces of discourse, reflection, and knowledge generation. At the heart of this deliberation is whether typography is simply a domain of practice or a knowledge discipline, with field of research that informs the activities with practical, commercial, or otherwise applications. The youthfulness of the discipline is not unique. The humanities and social sciences are products of the 20th century, with some disciplines tracing foundational texts within the span of a couple or three careers. Arguably, typography is only a very few decades late in establishing its core tenets. Following these parallels, we could have expected typography to go through a period where a small group of researchers established key directions of inquiry and published texts that would eventually be seen as foundational, and gradually establish a field with reasonably clearly defined boundaries and relationships with other disciplines. That such developments may take place within institutions like universities is important. There, research and learning are inseparable from the mechanism of designing academic programs of study, assembling book lists, compiling lectures, setting assignments, and so on. In other words, a university-like environment can only really produce things it knows how to give shape to and fold into its operational model. While there are purely research-oriented establishments, they tend to fall within established discipline boundaries which align to funding streams. New discipline formation requires outliers, those who see space for new knowledge between or outside the disciplines that hand out degrees. And it is fortunate that the examples of typography can be compared with were not reliant on expensive, complicated equipment for research to happen. More often than not, new branches of the humanities and social sciences relied on hours spent in libraries or shoes worn out in the field. Recent advances in computing and the study of the human brain have rewritten the research methodologies for disciplines such as psychology, linguistics, and philosophy. But where these developments establish new disciplines, it is with one or both feet well within the boundaries of existing domains. New fields of research are therefore formulated in relation to the fields they borrow from. often the fields the pioneers started their careers in, and in relation to the institutions they are located in. So while foundational texts arguably date from the late 60s, pretty late. Even in the broader field of graphic design, we may see people like Martha Scottford asking, is there a canon of graphic design in the 90s? Meredith Davis asking, why do we need doctoral study in design in the 2000s? And then Priscilla Farias and Jeremy Ainsley writing about typographic history's 3 decades of research. This is very short timescales. Typography is quite unlike these other disciplines. Despite being a recent and in many quarters still very insecure research-informed discipline, it drags behind it a very long tail of primary and secondary sources that sit uncomfortably in institutional libraries and seminar rooms. Pre-industrial practice in typography has relied on the transmission of informal, undocumented, and secretive learning. Small, itinerant operations with guild-controlled apprenticeships and often precarious business continuity, and a continent essentially at war with itself pretty much continuously, in case we forget. And of course, I'm talking about Europe. Few commercial outfits survived long enough to assemble substantial resources. The plant in Moretus operation stands out for its size and longevity, as much as for its precarious allegiances that essentially ensured its survival in the end. On the other hand, most sustained operations existed under protection of rurals or institutions, like the Propaganda Fide, the Imprimerie Royale, the university presses in England. The few texts from the pre-industrial phase of typography reflect these contexts. Joseph Moxon's Mechanic Exercises, Pierre-Simon Fournier's Manuel Typographique, and John Johnson's Typographia establish a model of a singular authority that describes and determines a canonical viewpoint into practice. There is little discussion of rationales for typographic options or contextualizing in relation to material resources and textual sources. Such texts are written almost without any reference to the works that informed them, and often disguise their debt to previous texts, since this would be seen to recognize a competing authority. They are snapshots of a single authorial voice, notably Northern, male, Christian, established. Texts more overtly associated with the Enlightenment, specifically the Description des Arts de Métier from the Académie des Sciences and the articles in the Encyclopédie, foreground descriptive practices. This is the frontispiece from the Encyclopédie, which is truth. Very interesting idea that there's a singular truth that you can describe with very rigorous processes and then document it. Like these examples, these are linear texts, defined very much by the format in which they appear. They largely or entirely separate the practice of typemaking, typesetting, and printmaking from the wider context within which these activities happen. The engraved visual narratives artificially fix in place fluid processes and transactions like tableaux vivants that explain as much as they hide. This elision of key agent is considerable. The many women and children we know were present in these places are moderated or absent. Similarly absent from these accounts are the processes of handling the physical resources and interim objects in the course of making book blocks, from material storage and handling in the run-up to impression, to the drying and folding of printing sheets. There is precious little documentation, not least to protect guild-controlled operations. These models of explaining typography persist. The transformative effects of precision metallurgy in the 19th century and the gradual mechanization of typographic processes brought texts that remain high on descriptive detail and low on reflection and connections to the wider currents of a world that is changing rapidly. T.L. Devini's composition, correct composition, and subtitle titles are very good examples of these. They're very clear in specifying how to do the practice with a voice of authority that bears no doubt. Indeed, even in the 20th century, what passes for key text in typography is rooted in craft teaching for gradually more formalized technical education, with only a very few attempts at more generalized discussions of typographic matters. For example, Joseph Thorpe's article on the nomenclature of letter forms. Everything is determined very much by the industrial production at large scale across very clear engineering metaphors. Still, these are only generalized discussions for specific typefaces, primarily from the monotype catalog, rather than examination of the system for naming things, the scope of a naming system and the implications for any approach, rather poor in covering how these apply to other environments. These texts remain within the sphere of strictly commercial operations and education connected to applied trades. This learning took place in institutions that were never far off their roots in apprenticeship models and always at an arm's length from the typographic scholarship that was emerging in response to the arts and crafts movement.
The typographic texts of the period are entirely in keeping with an Anglo-centric model of the world, infuse the perspective of a colonial empire that is selectively European and mostly for things past. For example, canonical histories of typography in English give the impression that printing in the Italian peninsula ceased being worthy of merit in the beginning of the 19th century. We also see how other scripts are documented in European editions as additions are exotics, as the extra bit that you need a very little bit to handle only very specific kinds of texts. These narratives are also extremely narrow in their definition of typography. They're almost exclusively about books, even as illustrated magazines and newspapers grew at an explosive rate after the middle of the 19th century. Posters for advertising were unavoidable in urban environments, and trade relied on illustrated catalogs at a scale that compares to Amazon today. And crucially, these narratives do not acknowledge the output of missionary presses and its impact and its influences, let alone presses established in colonial lands or neutral territories by local operators. The reporting of printing activities in regions of other writing systems, although using very different terminology, is usually flattening and trivializing, and usually relies on narrow reports from visitors rather than first-hand narratives from local observers or participants. By contrast, the presence of other writing systems in the catalogs of type foundries is substantial, from Caslon to the Imprimerie Nationale to Schelter and Giesecke for foundry type, and throughout Monotype and Linotype's catalogs for hot metal composition, the global type market was not occasional or incidental. The specimens indicate a considerable market beyond Europe, making its omission in canonical text all the more glaring. Especially as we start looking into the resources for the production, we see a huge market being taken advantage of, which is almost not referenced at all in the educational texts. The contrast between the primary source of type specimens and the canonical narratives should raise the alarm for researchers seeking to decenter typographic scholarship and emphasize the imperative of returning to primary sources. Similarly absent is the representation of work produced in printing presses such as Istanbul and Cairo, about which we will be undoubtedly hearing today. The absence of recognition of these works cannot be attributed only to matters of survival or access. Material resources may survive in archives that do not look and feel like archives, but in private, commercial, or institutional collections that are outside the international scholarship network. Preservation may not imply necessarily physical accessibility. Ownership may be under authorities whose remit may not include engaging with external agents, and forms of storage and description may not be accessible outside the local language and system of cataloging. This absence of representation, therefore, indicates that inclusion in canonical narratives assumed a form of preserving, describing, and making accessible of materials that correspond to external assumptions. This imposition of a European model of thinking about typographic materials, collections, and archives is a subtle mechanism of exclusion and disenfranchisement. In turn, this exclusion creates the impression that there is no discourse on typographic matters outside the channels of established, again, European scholarship. We do know, however, that this is not the case. Discourse exists, but may be inaccessible in terms of language or community to those compiling canonical narratives. Examples centering on script and typographic reform are gradually documented more widely. Recent research has documented the debates on modernization within the Armenian diaspora in Paris, for example, with multiple debates on the reform of Arabic in different regions are still being uncovered. In the Balkans, where writing systems, languages, and communities overlap and intersect, in a geography of unparalleled density, the typographic dimension of discourse on modernization is central to understanding debates on ethnic and national identity and community trajectories, in opposition to narratives that often quite flatten the other and simplify historical continuity. These observations point to another dimension of exclusion, that of applying external geographic categorizations with a lack of understanding of how practice and discourse evolve in regions where political boundaries change drastically. Thus, innovation and developments in typography in the broader region of the Eastern Mediterranean during the Ottoman Empire are rendered opaque in the construction of national histories for the states that replaced it, the breaking up of networks of knowledge and recognition, and the broader distortion of the Orientalist lens in Western discourse. This geographic and cultural bias in typographic narratives continues throughout the majority of the 20th century. We can detect this in exclusion along the lines of power. Most obviously those of empire, overseas as well as near empire, as Ireland was for the British, the Balkans and East Mediterranean for the Austro-Hungarian Empire, but also of looser and less transparent spheres of influence in those regions where overlapping communities and layered local histories defied simple narratives. Another axis of exclusion is that of class. Typography is discussed by and amongst the profession or craft elite, often in literary and artistic modes. The focus of what are strictly speaking signifiers of middle-class belonging, not without further aspirations, is sharpened by the omission of any discussion, let alone celebration, of periodical publications of ephemera, like the posters and catalogs I showed earlier. A focus on exclusionary cultural references, such as the frequent reprint of text in classical Greek, here an Oxford Homer from 1900, on one hand, and microtypography on the other, frame an elevation of private press outputs as a natural evolution of the indulgent editions of Bodoni and Morris for the 20th century, objects that mark people who own them as different from the working classes and the hoi polloi who cannot understand them. These editions and the texts that discuss them, not least periodicals such as the Fleron, Alphabet and Image, Typography and Typographica, created an artificially purified concept of typographic perfection. There's a direct connection between this highbrow attitude and European modernism. The fuzzy line between typography and artistic expression of the early modernism of Filippo Marinetti, Theo van Doesburg, and Laszlo Moholy-Nagy found an institutional expression in the Bauhaus. The typography of Bauhaus was a perfect totem, a source extinguished before the theories could even be really tested in sustained typographic applications. Its tenets were open to reinterpretation and transmutation in whatever context the teachers escaping persecution found themselves. The same lesson can be detected in the work of Jan Tschichold, whose early propositions for commercial work, most notably in Die Neue Typographie, were never tested by the audience they should be seeking to address, while his later volte-face at Penguin has mostly been described in accommodating tones. Again, it is interesting to guess if the same expressions, the same pronouncement had been made by a minority person, where they would be received with that kind of accommodation. This trend reached a stylistic dead end after the Second World War. It mutated into the often sterile formalism of the Swiss, an international style. Its text celebrated as manifesto of practice, but for very narrow genres, of Eurocentric documents, and still for highbrow arrangements. The adoption of this style for commercial typography does not signify a move into a wider or lay culture. It becomes the identifying pattern of an urban, white-collar, usually Anglophone white expression. And despite some progressive declarations, it is often aligned with the commercialization of the post-war boom and early forms of globalization, with no significant reflection on its applicability outside the social context of its origination. We can see in its adoption almost wholesale in other regions this desire to join into this upward movement and adopt models for evaluating design that are entirely imported. The entry of computing in the world of typography was heralded as a force for democratization. Despite its eventual role in undoing the oligopoly of the hardware-based linotype and monotype, digital technology did not really fulfill that promise. The centralization of this emerging knowledge discipline happened initially through the geographic and linguistic concentration of computing innovation, mostly in the northwestern coast of the United States, and gradually through the domination of platforms based in the West and largely operated on criteria for performance that underrepresent non-Western priorities. The result is one where typographic solutions for the majority of readers globally are developed as adaptations of pre-existing models for a Western perspective, or more precisely, a narrowly Anglophone one. The mechanism of developing global solutions ought to often neglect lay practice, local print traditions, and the nuance common in cultures with deep and complex cultural and historical narratives. In turn, lay practice adopts the norms and techniques of imported systems. These masquerade as global, but very much export a very direct way of seeing things. In case you're wondering, ask any Israeli designers if Hebrew has an italic, and then see that the sign maker decorating the side of the van definitely thinks that you can hit the I button in InDesign and get an italic for your sign. Indeed, the concept of high typography, often from the voice of singular learned authority, has evolved and survived across genres and technologies of rendering. It has been adapted and exported outside Western culture and eventually informed ideas of typographic authority globally through the idolizing translation and absorption of Western, although mostly still just Anglophone, patterns for typography, document layout, and graphic language more widely. This trend has been amplified by the globalization of design education through the adoption of models promoting uniformity of teaching and learning methodologies, and the franchising of courses by established Western universities to institutions outside Europe and North America. This process, amplified through the impact of the European Bologna process since its signing in 1999, does not only transfer program specifications, but entire quality assurance procedures, staff training and promotion criteria, and of course reference lists for students. The digitization of institutional libraries exacerbates this effect, since franchise students can access the resources of the primary partner through logging in remotely, an explicit and unmoderated transfer of a frame of reference from one culture to another. There have been attempts to counter this monolithic narrative in recent decades. The first notable work in this strand was Michael Twyman's Printing 1770-1970, a bottom-up reframing of the British typographic narrative, taking up ephemera, social history, technology, and agency. This work sits alongside broader narratives, such as Elizabeth Eisenstein's The Printing Press as an Agent of Change, 1979, and Lucien Febvre and Henri Jean Martin's The Coming of the Book, in 1984 already, which set a mold for framing printing, if not necessarily typography, as a lens for examining societal changes. Note that these are extremely recent titles. There is a growing strand of works in this vein, but notably, these works tend to prioritize a print historical approach and not consider practice as a domain with dynamic relationship with research. They also have mostly European subject matters, are produced within Western networks of publication, and in formats that are relevant to Western scholarship. This last point is quite important, that even as we're trying to open up and decolonize academic production, people are expected still to produce things that look and feel like academic books, have the formats of established models of output, are produced within existing networks, and of course are published within the publishing networks and often paywalls of Western publishers. Typeface design has in the very recent decades offered some works that combine contextualization with critical analysis of the outputs of practice. Notable as the likely earliest example is Fiona Ross's The Printed Bengali Character and Its Evolution from 1999. Based on her PhD, it informed subsequent research at that level, mostly within the University of Reading, but indirectly elsewhere as well. And while some of these theses get eventually published in book form, many remain inaccessible for copyright reasons behind institutional embargoes or paywalls. By contrast, there's a growing number of practice-orientated works and actions on typeface design across writing systems. These evidence demand by practitioners for structured information and the recognition that at least some elements of the typeface design process require an engagement with research outcomes. The structure, format, and approach in some books, publications, events, and so on varies widely, as does the degree to which they're informed by research and how the connection with practice is made in each text. Indeed, the very definition of how research informs practice varies hugely, which is an indication that we still have quite a lot of work in explaining and exploring this term. In summary, across writing systems, the bibliography and research-informed practice in typography is partial at best, very inconsistent, and still at a very early stage of clarifying its objectives. There are few available titles that are accessible to researchers and practitioners alike, and few are still written in the reflective, decentering approach that current scholarship and public discourse demand. I note this recent conference only a few weeks ago in nearby Lebanon, and reading a report from this, a young attendee was commenting on the rediscovery of ways of seeing the Arabic script. There I said it, I used the word Arabic, in their environment, in a society that has its own particular relationship with the script, with the language, with the culture, a multi-layered environment that defies very simple categorizations and parallelisms with other countries or regions using the same resources. It shows us how, even as a new generation is discovering or rediscovering its culture and heritage and beginning to dig into the complexity of this culture, that there is quite a lot of work simply in just informing people of the scope of the work to be done. It's against this backdrop that this volume sits. It constructs narratives from a decentralized perspective with a critical eye to establishing scholarship and equipped to substantiate a new framing with evidence that draws on archival material. The importance of this is difficult to overestimate. The return to original materials, the primary sources, is the only way that we can be sure that we are protecting ourselves from all the biases and very partial perspectives that I outlined earlier. Applying methodologies that are clear, transparent, well-documented, and extendable, this volume represents a model of knowledge generation that is rare in typography, and for that matter, typeface design as well. The documentation of support for practice through research allows this text to be interrogated on the basis of qualitative analysis rather than secondary associations. There is no claim by any of the authors, perhaps with the exception of myself, of any authority that is not founded in research that is accompanying their statements. The approach essentially is independent of the specific script. It is a script-agnostic methodology and therefore transferable to other writing systems. This is a critical litmus test for methodological integrity. As a model for knowledge generation, this book is sensitive to both historical contexts and cultural concerns and reinforces informed reflective practice. It can be claimed, I think without exaggeration, to represent a paradigm shift for typographic scholarship across writing systems. I should also add as a footnote that its reasonably accessible price is part of its accessibility, of this importance. A lot of important texts are behind publishers' price lists that make them entirely inaccessible to people who are practitioners, lay members, and so on. That this is produced at the price that is possible for designers to access this kind of scholarship without a huge outlay is actually a significant part of its appeal. I opened with a quote, and I will close with another one. This is from the London Review of Books, the last issue. There we are. Oh, there we are. Yeah, by William Davis. He was discussing the development of sociology as a field of study in its relation to history. And this quote caught my eyes, the idea that we should not be absent from our discoveries. It's a very elegant way of pointing to the problem of talking about things that we are very deeply involved in, we might have very strong feelings about, and yet our partial view is something that's reflected in everything we formulate. And a lot of the texts that we keep referring to, myself first of all, because I have to construct these book lists that I mentioned about, I have to suggest things to people to read, I have to start with something that I might then need to take apart and unpack. This is something that is absolutely central to how we move forward. And I think this first publication, really covering a kind of ground that has not been covered before, is the first starting point. Thank you very much.